afternoon and welcome to the New America Foundation. My name is Sarah Mead and I'm a Senior Research Fellow here at New America. I'm excited to have you all here today to talk about what I think is an important and interesting topic for the future of school reform and school districts here in the United States. In the past 15 years of school reform efforts, we've seen the emergence of two related but rather different strands of thought or tracks of work on education reform. One of those strands of thought has really viewed school districts as an essential unit of change for school reform and improvement, and has focused on improving school district management, building capacity of district leaders, aligning curriculum and teaching across a district as the key strategy to improve student achievement. Another strand of thought has sought to advance reform outside of the existing school district system, creating charter schools, supporting the creation of alternative educational service providers, building capacity outside of districts, and increasing autonomy for district schools. Now, in a lot of cases, we've seen these approaches working together as part of a reform vision. New York, I think, where Chancellor Klein has simultaneously sought to reform the district schools and also support the creation of new charters and small schools, is a pretty good example here. DC is also an example where we've seen a lot of district-focused school reform work with Chancellor Rhee and some of her predecessors, while at the same time this emergence of a very vibrant charter school sector that's educating almost 40% of the district students. And when we look at the reforms the Obama administration has supported in education, their initiatives with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, Race to the Top, the Investing in Innovation Fund, they also seem to be supporting both those approaches. But I think there are some questions about the extent to which these two different approaches, a district-focused and a sort of outside-of-district approach, really are complementary, whether they can coexist in the long term, and whether reformers would do better to put most of their eggs in one of these baskets rather than looking at both pieces. As states develop their Race to the Top applications and as Congress begins considering reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, some tensions between these approaches are likely to emerge as important policy issues, and there's a need for further discussion about them. We hope that today's discussion will help shed light on those tensions as well as areas of common ground between these two strands of reform and help policymakers and our audience think critically about this issue going forward. I'm very pleased that we have here today two individuals who are both very distinguished in the field of education reform, but have pretty different views about their path reform should take in the future, particularly regarding the role of school districts. Checker Finn is the president of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Education, and the author of numerous books and articles on education reform, including most recently Troublemaker, A Personal History of School Reform Since Sputnik. Gordon McInnes is a former New Jersey State Senator and Assistant Commissioner of Education, and is the author most recently of In Plain Sight, Simple Difficult Lessons from New Jersey's Effort to Close the Achievement Gap. He is currently a fellow at the Century Foundation and a consultant to the Foundation for Child Development. Checker and Gordon are each going to speak for about 5 to 10 minutes here about their thoughts on the role of school districts in education reform. Then we'll have a bit of discussion and back and forth between the two of them and with me. And finally, we'll open it up to questions for the audience. So to start, I'll turn it over to Checker.
Okay. Can I stand up for the first part?
Yes, you can.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. Nice to be here. If there was ever an area where we need a new America, it's this one, because the old America isn't working very well. It's my job in these opening comments to explain why I think that the school district as we know it has run its course, and that we need to think of a very different organizational and structural arrangement for American K-12 education. I want to offer 5 points, and I assume we'll come back and elaborate and probe in the course of the conversation to follow. First, I want to suggest that local school districts, as we know them, are obsolete, dating back to a time when this was a geographically localized country, not a mobile modern society, and to when most people lived in relatively small, relatively homogeneous communities, not in today's highly diverse megalopolises, and to a time when localities paid most of the education bill, not today's complex finance system where state and federal governments cover the lion's share of the education budget. They were an excellent idea in 1880. They are not a workable idea in American society of 2009. Secondly, they are obsolete in management terms. They are, in essence, middle management in American education. They're what comes between the production units, namely the schools, and the policy, finance, and accountability units, which are essentially states. If this were corporate America, they'd be eliminated as a layer that the corporation doesn't need, cannot afford, and that indeed gets in the way of getting things done. Third, they are, for the most part, sources of stodginess and dysfunction, particularly in urban America. They are not engines of change and reform. Sure, you can point to a very few exceptions. Sarah named 2 of the most prominent out of maybe 10 nationwide. But in a country with 15,000 local school districts, I would invite you to come to Ohio or Michigan or maybe New Jersey, and I would defy you to find a single district in this entire state, at least an urban district, that could legitimately be described as a source of reform and improvement. Fourth, one reason for their dysfunction is that their own customary pattern of governance doesn't work. Again, certainly not in urban America. The locally elected school board, as we know it, might still be a success in small towns and some suburbs. But in far too many cases, particularly in districts with the most troubled schools and the neediest kids, the locally elected school board has been captured by interest groups, by single-issue types, by aspiring politicians for whom this is a stepping stone to higher office, and they are not the sort of noble community, civic-minded leaders that everybody had in mind in the progressive era when the locally elected separate school board was invented as a governance structure for American education. They are full of people with grudges. They are frequently taken over by the teachers' union itself, particularly when the superintendent or the previous board does something that the union doesn't like. This is not a governance system that works, not in a reform era anyway. Moreover, the separation of education governance from general purpose government in these communities causes services to be ruptured, whether it's preschool or healthcare or juvenile justice or you name it. Causes services to be ruptured that ought to be seamless and integrated. And it leads to many costs and inefficiencies. And fifth and finally, we have ample experience, most recently with NCLB these last 8 years, ample experience that they cannot fix themselves. Find me more than a couple of examples of districts that have successfully turned around failing schools or successfully conferred meaningful choices of better schools on families that needed them, or that have successfully narrowed the achievement gap. All you really have to do is look at yesterday's NAEP results from a dozen or so of America's big cities, and you find what I think could only be described as a flat line. It's not getting better. It's not good, and it's not getting better. And we need to face the fact that it's not going to get better because they are constitutionally and organizationally incapable of fixing themselves and their schools. Yes, again, 6, 8, 10 exceptions around the country, but the exception in this case does not prove the rule. The exception proves that, of course, there are exceptions. The rule in this case is not working. We need something very different. And my own basic concept of what we need instead is a direct relationship between states and individual schools. In effect, turning every school into something akin to a charter school, empowering it with control over personnel and budget and curriculum and you name it, and making it directly accountable for its results to a suitable state authority, which in turn funds those schools on the basis of a weighted and portable financing arrangement. Do away with middle management, allow the schools to purchase services as and where they see fit, get the bureaucrats off their backs, hire school leaders who are capable of leading, and reinvent our approach to structuring American public education. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Let's see, Union City, West New York, Perth Amboy, Elizabeth, Orange, Long Branch, Pleasantville, New Jersey. There's 7. I might be able to come up with more in terms of that one question that was posed. There's a lot to cover in 10 minutes. I think that this has not been a equally balanced conversation that's been going on for the past 15 or 20 years. In fact, I would say that the attention to district improvement has been relatively light in both the policy discussion and in terms of the decisions that have been made about budgets and direction. The one exception recently might be the race to the top, the $3 billion plus where school districts have got to be incorporated into the state plan for improving and building on past improvements. But by and large, we have seen a conversation dominated by those who believe that this is a set of problems that can be solved at the school level. And you can go back to site-based management and school-based budgeting and to whole school reform, and now to charter schools and vouchers. The idea is that there are all these districts that get in the way, as Checker just said, and we need to eliminate that. Having worked in the State Department of Education, I would hesitate to, I fear to think about what might happen if the state of New Jersey, as an example, were dealing directly with 2,800 schools. And they can't do very well dealing with 555 school districts. So I don't believe there are a reservoir of flexible, nimble, student-based expertise. So let's look at what has happened in American education over the past 15 or 20 years, which says to me that you need districts. They should be better than they are. Sure, it's easy to pile on in terms of failed school districts. Many of them, particularly serving concentrations of poor kids, have done a woeful job. But in the meantime, the underlying conditions have changed enormously. And I want you to think about this in terms of the obligations that would be imposed on school leaders given these changes. The first change is that we have decided that we need to improve the rigor of academic standards in the United States. And nobody knows more about this, I think, than Checker Finn in terms of the woeful record in how states responded to the mandate in NCLB to come up with academic standards, at least in reading, math, and science. And most of them, of course, came up with academic standards for 7 or 8 or 9 disciplines covering grades at least through kindergarten to through 12th grade, in some cases pre-kindergarten through 12th grade. And if you look at those standards and try and translate them, if you're an elementary school principal, for example, in just about any state, I think, but certainly in New Jersey, you have a K-5 school, 700 kids. How is it that you and your faculty are going to untangle 350 new standards that have been promulgated by the State Board of Education covering science, foreign languages, social studies, technology, yes, reading and writing and mathematics, sciences? How are you going to translate that so that it becomes something that is concrete and useful to a teacher in, let's say, 5th grade social studies in December? And where are you going to find the time and expertise to decide, well, what other materials should we bring to the classroom in order to make certain that our children are learning what's required for social studies in December of 5th grade? I don't see that schools are in a position to do that. States are happy to provide you with the standards, and in some cases, most cases, they will provide you with a framework which will take the standards from a document pile this thick to a document pile that thick, and written with a sort of sleep-inducing prose characteristic of most state documents. So you start with the fact that we have changed the game, and NCLB has sealed the victory of those who were seeking standards-based reform or standards-based instruction. And so you now have a layer of mandated tests, grades 3 through 8, and one high school grade. And you have attention to this in terms of the consequences for schools and districts that fail to meet whatever state standards are set. And as we know, those standards are not a very good measure in most places of whether or not students are learning. We just saw the case in New York State where we've seen this rapid, great increase in student achievement statewide, and now NAEP comes out, and it turns out, gee, at least in terms of the academic standards being measured by NAEP, there's been no progress or very little progress in New York. How do you explain this steep curve upwards? If you look at the states with the best percentages of students who are judged to be proficient in 4th, 8th grade math and reading, you will find Tennessee, Mississippi, and Texas near the top as being states with the highest performance. And then when the NAEP results come in, none of them can crack 39th. So you have, and some of them are in the high 40s. So there's this mismatch between what was contemplated by the standards movement and what is on the ground as a consequence of 50 state decisions and NCLB. So the idea of translating all of that at the school level, I think, is virtually impossible. Not if you're running a school efficiently and trying to run it effectively. The second thing that has happened in the last 20 years is that we have witnessed the Latinization of many school districts and most states. And, you know, NAEP is a pretty good way to track this. In 1990, 6% of the kids who took the 4th and 8th grade NAEP tests were Latinos. And in 2009, 20% were Latinos. I don't know of another time where we have witnessed such a rapid demographic shift of this magnitude. I don't think there has been one, but maybe I'm wrong. And this has brought with it an enormous increase in the number of students who come from very poor families where no English is spoken, and in many cases where Spanish is not read. And this provides a real pedagogical puzzle. And it's not now just a problem for California, New Mexico, Texas, Florida, New York, New Jersey, and Illinois. It's a problem for most states in the Union. As Latinos have migrated and become important parts of the schools in Georgia, North Carolina, Iowa, etc. So this is a puzzle for people who have not dealt prior to this time with large numbers of poor Latinos who have very limited English proficiency and who come from very poor homes where there is little proficiency in Spanish. Because it does turn out that there's a big difference between educating a kid who comes in after going to school for 6 years in Buenos Aires or Lima, Peru, and is now in 5th or 6th grade, and educating somebody who comes from Chiapas, where they've been to school maybe for 7 or 8 months over 5 years, and where they come possibly with a first language that's not Spanish. And if you want to have a daunting puzzle to solve, try and solve that at the school level. How do you find out what works with this new population? And there are lots of tensions within school districts, to be sure, about how to deal with this. And sometimes the political incentives to try and crack these puzzles is not very strong. You have Latinos moving into, for example, districts that are controlled by African Americans, where the town council, the city council, the mayor, the school board, middle management of the school district is dominated entirely by African Americans with very little experience in educating Latinos and with no political pressure to see it happen. And that's a combination which makes it very difficult to bring the intensity and focus that's required when you're addressing such complicated problems. The third thing I would mention as a trend in American public education is the increase in poverty. It's not as marked as the increase in Latinos, but it's still substantial and noticeable. We have close to half the students now on the NAEP exam are eligible for either free or reduced meals. And that is up noticeably over the last 20 years. Poverty brings with it some things that we've known for a very long time. We know that poor kids growing up in an average poor home start kindergarten 18 months behind their middle class peers in terms of vocabulary, general knowledge, their familiarity with stories, their familiarity with print. 18 months behind. They're only 5 years old. That is quite a gap. That gap has not been addressed by most school districts. But to think that you could address that at the school level, it seems to me, is virtually impossible. Because what it argues for is to start earlier. And to start earlier with a high-quality preschool where you have a chance to narrow the gap at this chronologically urgent time in the development of a kid's life so that they have a fighting chance to become a reader. And if they don't become readers at grade level by the time they're in 3rd or 4th grade, their chances of ever reading at grade level are down to about 1 in 10. That is a morally outrageous position to put a 9 or 10-year-old kid into, and it's not an acceptable one. But the idea that at the school level you could solve that problem or address it by reaching out institutionally to create high-quality preschools that would be a feeder for your kindergarten and 1st grade classrooms, that's not possible. That's obviously something that requires leadership at the state level, but also it requires focus and intensity at the district level. So if you want to solve these problems, the notion that you can do it school by school, it seems to me, is close to delusional. Otherwise, I think we're in pretty close agreement.
Thanks, Gordon. Since Checker got to speak, Checker spoke first and then Gordon got to respond to some of Checker's points, do you want to take maybe 2 minutes, Checker, to respond to some of Gordon's points?
Mostly I want to say that he didn't defend school districts. He correctly pointed out some major challenges in American education. He successfully impugned state education departments for not doing a very good job either. And he did illustrate some of the difficulties of expecting individual schools to do the whole thing. But I don't think he made a persuasive or even very energetic defense of school districts as an organizational and governance unit in American education. And I am honest to God not persuaded that having 7 examples out of 555 in New Jersey refutes my point, which is that by and large they're not working very well.
Oh, I didn't include suburban districts in my list. I now have 204 additional districts to add to the list. Let me just say that the record suggests, and particularly in fairly complicated, tough places, that districts that do assume responsibility and do focus on bringing young children to the point of literacy and by 3rd and 4th grade produce results that indicate a narrowing of the achievement gap much stronger than anything that can be put forward by charter school proponents or voucher proponents or school-by-school proponents, whatever color and ilk they are. And so I think that we have seen in Montgomery County, Maryland, right across the border here, a district where 65,000 Title I eligible kids constitute by itself the 35th, 38th largest district. It's embedded in the 18th or 16th largest district. They've given attention to starting early, giving more time to these issues, and they have produced results that are stunning. The same is true in Union City, West New York, Elizabeth, New Jersey, Orange, New Jersey, where this focus on early literacy is producing results now at the 8th grade level, which have not been seen in any districts across the country. So I think that yes, this is hard stuff. And the idea that it somehow is mechanically simple, as would be suggested by Checker in his remarks, and that all we have to do is just get the schools to be left alone by their districts, I think is unworkable.
No, not just be left alone, be well led, be empowered, be accountable, be given the finances, be given the authority, be given the leadership, and not be impeded by the middle management of the overwhelming majority of school districts in America. I live in Montgomery County, and on the whole, and I largely believe this new book about Jerry Wiest's miracle. And so, sure, it can be done. But these are rare exceptions. This is not the way American education is working.
Well, if you look at the results from charter schools, which is the latest edition, it's now a 2-decade-old edition of the school-by-school approach, the results are no more encouraging, certainly. I mean, if you look at the Stanford study, 17% of charter school students do better than their district peers. That's not a very high percentage.
That's one Stanford study. That's the Mackie Raymond Stanford study. Then there's the Caroline Hawksby Stanford study. The studies don't agree about charter schools, and I'm not going to claim that they are a slam dunk either. But they are. But they're an unresolved experiment or an incomplete experiment.
So why bet so much on it? And if they look like the district schools in terms of the percentage of their students who are English learners and the percentage of their students who are special education students, then we would have even a tougher test for charter schools. They're not even close to those percentages practically any place in the country.
So I think we could have a really long debate about the body of evidence on charter schools
Yes,
here today. But I'd actually like to drill down a little bit more on this point about, Gordon, can you get a little more specific and concrete in terms of very specific things, very specific resources, approaches, tools that you believe districts can provide that cannot be provided in a charter model or in an individual school model? And then, Checker, one of the things I've heard you talk about before is emergence of some other entities that may be able to fulfill that role. So after Gordon talks about that, can you talk about what you believe may be some of the other models of accomplishing that? And maybe talk a little bit about that piece of this issue.
Well, if you take the vision, and this is going to, I know it sounds like I'm not answering your question, Sarah. If you take the vision as expressed for charter schools and translate that typically stated vision that these children are capable of learning what needs to be learned, it requires that you spend the time that is necessary to meet the needs of kids, and that usually means more time in the case of poor kids. But if you start with a vision of preparing graduates of your school district to attend four-year universities as your goal, and he mentioned Jerry Wiest, and that's the goal of the Montgomery County schools, that's the goal of the Union City schools, that's the goal of the... If you have that, then the district has to work with teachers and schools, principals, and subject matter people to identify what that means in the classroom and to support teachers who frankly are at a loss, typically contending with the problems brought on by the demography of their students and with the changes that are occurring and which are and tend to occur every time a new principal comes in or a new superintendent comes in or a new governor comes in or a new commissioner of education comes in. And they've been through the paces of a new reform every 18 months. They need to have a district that provides them with a concrete curriculum and the support and assistance that's required to teach to that curriculum and work with the problems that their kids present. That happens. Typically what happens is that they also start early. And that is the hallmark, I believe, of the most successful city districts in the country. And they recognize that if they don't deal with that gap at kindergarten, their chances of producing literate third graders is very small. And that is the gap that must be addressed. And which, and here you have alternatives where that's almost impossible to be included in the solution. And most states don't permit that with charter schools, for example. That should be changed. I'm a supporter of charter schools. I would like to see that changed. But by and large, that's not possible for most today. What it means is that you have clear benchmarks beginning in preschool, continuing through high school, where you express the goal not in terms of doing well on the state 11th grade science test. You express it in terms of percentage of your graduates who can score 3 or better on an advanced placement test and be eligible for placement in a 4-year university.
Well, at the risk of sounding like I'm channeling Rick Hess for a minute, most of the excitement in education reform these days is not actually occurring at the governmental level at all, not the local level, not the state level, not the federal level. It's occurring through CMOs and similar organizations that now increasingly span districts and states and sometimes the whole country. Through Aspire schools and high-tech high schools and KIPP schools and Uncommon schools and K-12 and Wireless Generation and these nonprofit and for-profit operators and franchisors and providers and vendors that are in many cases running some very exciting schools, bringing interesting resources of brain power and money and technology to bear on what they're doing. As I said, transcending traditional governmental lines, especially district lines, but often now state lines, and in a few cases national lines, because some of them are going international with their programs. Some of them are delivering, I think, very encouraging results. In some of these cases, some are very top-down, but others are run in a kind of school-empowered mode where the central entity, whatever it is more like a franchisor or a vendor of services to schools that want to purchase the services. Probably the best-known brand, which is KIPP, doesn't literally run its schools centrally at all. It trains their leaders centrally, but it doesn't tell them what to teach or how to budget or what kind of facility to be in or any of that stuff. It assumes that the leaders then will deliver the goods and buy, if they want, some services from KIPP, but also from other vendors, including districts or regional education service centers or states if they want to. So I think these, I'll just call them non-governmental deliverers of education services are where much of the action is today, and may turn out to be a better idea than either state or district when it comes to operating successful educational institutions.
So what do you have, 500 out of 110,000 schools maybe, with all of those groups that you mentioned?
It's like your 7 urban districts out of 555 in New Jersey.
No, it's 7 out of 30 in urban districts in New Jersey. And what you have is what we've always had. We've always had sort of 10% solutions bouncing around. If you are able to attract the kids from families that are seeking alternatives and are most anxious to see their kid, that you have a really good chance. We've had magnet schools for 40 years that have done this. We have had special circumstances of stable leadership in district schools over a 10-year period that have produced amazing results. And we categorized all this with the More Effective Schools debate of 30 years ago. We've known about this. It's always been the 10% solution. And we need to have the 90% solution. And the 90% solution I don't believe is going to come through this very slow process of developing alternatives through the marketplace and through these combined funding resources at state and local levels and philanthropic institutions for a few charter school operators.
But the modal leadership of at least urban school districts now is about 18 months. It's not stable leadership at all. And superintendency is a revolving door, and we have painful experience all over the place that when a superintendent makes waves, look at Alan Burson, at Roy Romer, at any number of examples, superintendent makes waves, they are in effect thrown out at the next school board election by vested interests that can't stand to have waves made. This is not a formula for success either.
It's called democracy.
So I actually find things compelling in the arguments that both of you are making on this point, but there are a couple things in each of your sets of arguments that really hang me up. So let me sort of put before each of you the question that I think is the biggest challenge to me in each of those. For Checker, I think you do make a fairly compelling case that districts are outdated, they're no longer necessary, this middle management function some of these roles could be better carried out by other organizations. Where I get hung up is on this issue of the really high mobility rate of kids, particularly high poverty urban areas, and sort of this reality that kids who are coming from high poverty backgrounds are moving among a lot of different schools during their time in the educational system, and the concerns about what happens when kids move from radically different school environments over time. Does that indicate there's some need for some kind of district or other geographic entity level effort to align curriculum and instructional practices within, if you don't want to call it a district, some other regional entity to provide a coherent experience for those kids? And if you move towards a more diverse system with more autonomous schools, how do you provide that for kids? And then you can answer that, and then I'll get to Gordon with my question for him.
It's an important question. Really, 2 points. One is that if the standards thing were done well, subject by subject and grade by grade, it would cause a high degree of commonality in 5th grade math or 6th grade English or 7th grade social studies or 8th grade science, whatever, from school to school to school in terms of at least what is being taught to those kids in that grade, in that year, in that subject. Now, Gordon is certainly correct, and indeed Fordham has documented the miserable job that most states, though not every single one of them, have done at setting standards, and that's one of the reasons the country is now embroiled in discussion of national standards again and national tests to follow. And I suspect we're headed in that direction as a country, and that most states will eventually become part of that effort. So the uniform standards and assessments aligned with them will provide a properly done, a fair degree of the commonality that you're legitimately concerned about. The other point, though, is that these CMO type operators, these brand name schools, if you will, provide another kind of commonality that could, if there were more of them, keep up with a mobile population. You could have a kid going from an uncommon school in Brooklyn to an uncommon school in the Bronx to an uncommon school in New Rochelle to an uncommon school in Perth Amboy as the family moved. And in fact, the brand name schools spanning districts might turn out to be a better source of commonality in a mobile society than a district bureaucracy itself within the district boundaries.
So, Gordon, here's my question for you. I think you make a really good case about the effectiveness of Union City and some of the other districts in New Jersey where the districts have really shown leadership. But what you also express with, I think, a fair amount of frustration and in plain sight is that there are a number of districts in New Jersey where some of our neediest kids are that have proven over time persistently either unwilling or unable to do what's needed to improve education for children. And if we really do believe that districts need to be a fundamental change unit, what do we do from a policy perspective in the case of those districts? Do we need the state to take them over? Is it time in those districts for some of these outside models to come in as sort of an emergency response for those kids? Do we just wait until there's some kind of management change? What do we do for those districts?
I don't think there's a single answer, and I think that it is what you're talking about is trying to change the culture of both schools and districts so that instead of having routinized, formulaic, dry, textbook-driven instruction, you have much more tailored instruction. That requires enormous changes in terms of what teachers are doing and principals and district people are doing. Getting people to do that cannot be a mandate. It won't work. They've had the mandates for years. They've had more corrective action plans in Camden, New Jersey that would fill this room, and the progress reports would fill another room, and they're still stuck at a level that is offensively low. So, what is the answer in that case? Well, NCLB, it seems to me, has not worked in getting schools and districts to make the changes because it's unrelated to the work that has to happen in the district to get it changed. And it seems to me that the kind of leaders that Checker is hoping would spring forth to take over 30,000 urban schools in the country are in such short supply that you need to have a cooperative relationship between states and districts and between the districts and the schools to have a fighting chance. But it is hard work. And we consistently underestimate the difficulty of the work to be done. We're imprecise about the problems that need to be solved, and therefore we keep solving the wrong problems. And I think that's got to change, and you need to have a very frank, clear assessment, district by district, about what's required to have a fighting chance. And by the way, in the end, if they want to use their position to thwart that effort, they can be successful sometimes. And that's the frustration that I experienced trying to deal with Camden and Trenton, New Jersey.
Well, we probably agree about NCLB. I mean, the theory of action there is that states will fix broken districts and districts will fix broken schools. And in each case, we assume that the entity that allowed the breakage to occur in the first place is going to solve the problem. And in almost no case is that occurring. 7 years after the law was signed, the law was signed. So I don't think there's any reason to believe that's going to occur with additional sanctions or rules or requirements added.
So I still want to see if I can find some room for common ground here between the two
did.
of you. Yeah, well, no, that's true. I did. And I do
agreed
want
about
to
a
talk,
couple things.
I do want to talk a little bit more about NCLB in a couple of minutes, but I want to see if there's a model that can combine the value of what both of you are talking about. Gordon, I know you're familiar with New Jersey's Abbott PreK programs, and that strikes me as a model where the state is using diverse providers. So you've got these community-based providers, you've got the Head Start providers, you've got the YMCA, what have you, providing PreK in a model that's in some ways very charter-like because these are independent organizations, but the districts also have this very strong role to play in establishing a common curriculum district-wide, holding the providers accountable for quality, and making sure all children have access to a program. Do either of you think this is a model, sort of similar to sort of Paul Hill's portfolio model, that might work at the K-12 level to provide the benefits of a charter model and a district-led model for school reform, or what do you see with the potential problems there?
Well, this is a product of a court mandate, and had it not been mandated by the court and the funds, 100% of the funds provided by the state, I think we would have encountered a lot of reluctant K-12 educators in trying to bring that to pass. They were forced to contract as the district with willing providers who came forward and who presented nothing more than daycare licenses, but said we're willing to make all the changes required. What it meant was that since the skills and competencies and experience are not found in most K-12 districts, the state had to fill in that and to be systematic in upgrading the quality of preschool classroom instruction, if you will, and that worked. It didn't always work that it was organically connected to intensive early literacy beginning in kindergarten and first grade. But where it did, the improvements were dramatic. And is it a model? It's an expensive model. And this conversation is taking out a time at a place when people are looking to cut budgets and not to increase them. Is it something, if the federal government were to encourage it, where there is increased spending taking place, that you could adopt it at the local level with state leadership? Yes, it is, and should be, because I think it answers the question that we've identified so clearly and with such an immense amount of data for the last 4 decades about the about the social economic class predictor of how well kids will do in school and what that means in the early grades, that it is simply the most effective approach that we've uncovered any place. And it is not only intuitively and from research confirmed, but it's now being confirmed on the ground in the places that we've mentioned.
Well, I've been a fan of the portfolio approach ever since Paul came out with it, and I still am in theory. I think this is a way of reinventing school districts in a far more promising way than the way we have today, the sort of bureaucratic mold that we have today. But this idea has been out there for, I don't know, at least 5 years, and look around the country and see where it's been picked up. Well, once you get beyond Paul Vallis and Joel Klein and Arnie Duncan, and in the last 30 days, Ray Cortines, you don't see much evidence of anybody trying that. And when you look at their cities, they're just doing it with a little fraction of their city. They're creating a kind of mini district within the district, which they're using in the mini district a kind of portfolio approach. But for contractual reasons, legal reasons, political reasons, they're leaving the great bulk of their own district unscathed by the portfolio model. It's more like carving out an enterprise zone in a high tariff country. So I think the portfolio thing makes all kinds of sense in theory. I just don't see it happening much.
Well, I want to get to the audience for Q&A, but before we do that, I want to ask one more question of both of you. Since you both have been fairly critical of No Child Left Behind in your remarks, sort of given sort of the conversation we've had today, how do you think that the Obama administration and Congress should seek to alter the current federal approach to supporting education reform in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act? Since I know you could probably both talk about this for half an hour, see what you can cram into 2 minutes. And I'm watching the clock.
I'll be brief. They need to change the incentives in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act to incorporate the knowledge that we've had for so long about the essential role of an early start. And they need to be in a position to help finance that and to require it. And it needs to be a part of, because otherwise we're just going to be here 40 years from now talking about the same stuff without having enough improvement, because we're dealing with kids who are semi-literate when they're in 4th grade, and that pretty much cooks them. So we need to change that, and we know how to change it. That's the one place where we actually know how to do it, what to do. It's not easy. It's really easy for me to say it. It's real hard to do it on the ground, but it can be done.
I'll be even briefer. Modern management doctrine says be tight about ends and loose about means. And No Child Left Behind got that exactly backwards. No Child Left Behind is loose about ends and tight about means. And it isn't working, and it needs to be turned precisely upside down. A combination of national standards and tests on the one hand, and enormous freedom for schools and districts and states to get there on the other hand.
All right, we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. Maggie Severance from our team is going to come around with the mic. When you get the mic, please stand up, say your name, the organization you're from, and ask a question. Don't make a statement. If you make a statement, I will cut you off. All right, do we have any questions?
Don't you know about the rising inflection at the end of the statement? Don't you agree?
Hi, Jeff Schwartz with the Appalachian Regional Commission. I'm going to sort of halfway agree with Finn. While I don't think Gordon really skewered LEAs or the local school districts, Finn, you didn't really support knocking them down. You completely ignored the rural districts. You said that maybe the small towns and suburban schools were doing okay, but it was the urbans that gave you a problem. And if you look at those cities, their departments of health aren't doing any better than the schools. Police are having issues. So, Gordon, my question for you is, if the states can't manage 50 teams of effective, good quality people to get their schools in shape, what makes you think they can manage 15,000 teams of effective school districts? And Checker, if we can't get effective school districts, how can we get a couple of 100,000 effective schools?
you don't have to deal with 15,000 districts.
And it's only 100,000 schools, by the way.
No, it's up to 110,000 roughly. But you don't have to deal with 15,000 districts. Now, we have two gaps that we're talking about. The gap between the United States and Finland and Singapore is one gap, and maybe you do have to talk to all 15,000 districts or 100,000 plus schools about that. But we're talking about the gap that has been pervasive between middle class and poor kids in this country. And so you're talking 35% of the schools, roughly, and a smaller percentage of the districts where you need to have this action. I believe, based on what may be considered to be unusual circumstances that can't be replicated and never will be, that it is possible to organize at the state level teams of people that can work directly, concretely, cooperatively with districts to improve what happens in classrooms and produce dramatically better results. That can happen. It's easy for me to say that. The relentlessness that is required is probably not very common, and the focus on high performance is not always found, but it can be done.
Well, there's no quick formula for getting 100,000 high-performing schools. There are two, I'd say, kinds of interesting experiments underway in the country right now worth watching, one within a district, one outside. The within district is probably Joel Klein's effort to get the management concept right as he deals with the principals in New York City and empowers them on the one hand and holds them accountable on the other hand. And he's doing his best to devolve authority over all the key things, budget, personnel, et cetera, to the principals, and to hold them accountable and their schools for their performance. Now, is running into great difficulty in both ways, devolving and holding accountable, because of contractual stuff and state laws and other things, funding formulas that he can't alter, those kinds of things. But he's doing his best within a district, and then outside districts are these CMO-like ventures that are growing and seeing whether they can go from 5 schools to 10 schools to 40 schools. I mean, the current KIP plan in Houston is to get 40-plus schools in Houston, which and I think they've got the financing for that. When they get there, that's going to be 10% of all the kids in Houston. Now, you could say that's just a 10% solution, or you could say they are reinventing a school district, which will at that point have 20,000 kids in it, which is more than the Dayton public schools have in them. And if they can get to 10% of the kids in Houston, why couldn't they get to 20% with this kind of a management model, which is very different, or 30%, et cetera? In the end, schools need highly effective leaders, and to have highly effective leaders, we're going to have to reinvent our concept of what is a school principal. It is no longer going to be a former second-grade teacher who is paid 10% more than the other second-grade teachers. It's going to be a CEO, and they're going to have to be empowered and compensated accordingly, and they're going to come from very different places, not just from the second-grade classroom.
Another question.
Duncan Chaplin from Mathematica. I was kind of curious how you view. You talked a lot about empowerment. Chuck in particular talked about empowerment of the schools. I'm wondering how you're thinking about the empowerment of the low-income parents themselves. And as decision makers, I assume in many cases they're ideally would be voting in the elections that put in the school districts that you're not happy with. And so I'm wondering how your solution interfaces with the need to keep them involved in the system.
Well, Gordon said democracy in action. My version of empowering low-income parents is various versions of school choice that allow them to get out of bad schools and into other schools, which hopefully are better. We're up to 5,000 charter schools in the country right now, and they're not all good by any means, and in some places very few of them are good. But we are also at a point where by most of the NCES data, when you put it together, about 50% of all kids in American schools today are in a school that they or their family chose in one way or another, about half of all the kids. And I heard a competent analyst the other day say it's 60%, because he adds up the NCES data differently than I do. But whether it's 50 or 60%, that still leaves 40 or 50%, many of them low income, who don't have options to select their school. But there are any number of policy mechanisms for giving options to those families. Charters, vouchers, virtual schooling, inter-district choice. You can create quite a lengthy list. That's how I would empower low-income parents. I think to pretend that the low-income parent going to the voting booth to throw out the school board member who was put in by the teachers union, I think that's wishful thinking.
Well, with the trend in Latinization, and with the fact that 65% of Latinos in the United States are from Mexico, a large percentage of them are not citizens. So the voting option is not available in the places that probably most need it, or at least in some of the places where they most need it.
Maggie, we have a question up here in the front.
Hi, Emily Bloomfield, Stand for Children. I was going to ask, even if I thought that your solution was the best one, it's probably not realistic. But so what would be
Which of my solutions?
the sort of getting rid of school boards and school districts,
okay.
right?
Yes.
What would be the second best solution? I mean, what should people be advocating for?
We're in a think tank. We're not dealing with the real world. We're dealing with the world as it ought to be. So we don't need second best solutions. But the portfolio approach on the one hand and the CMO approach on the other hand, these both reinventing of districts under a very different set of ground rules, and these non-district operating units that I was talking about is probably the second best solution. And there are bits and pieces of those things going on. But I pointed out the small scale of the portfolio approach, and Gordon pointed out the small scale of the CMO approach. And so while this may be a good second choice, it is not a very, very widespread one today. Let's just put it that way.
And there's no evidence that when presented with the same profile of students as are found in the district schools, that CMOs would be effective. They simply don't have the English learners and the special education students. They haven't had that experience.
Robin Hickey from School Biz Match. Thank you, gentlemen, for the stimulating discussion. A while ago, Major Owen on the Committee on the Hill, in a discussion of all things about delivery standards, Checker, you may remember that.
I certainly remember him.
Yes. Made a statement that allowed, it was a quote, something like this. We're talking just as we are today about systemic improvement and really what to do, and everyone was very curious on how to solve it. And he said, well, you can't shoot the plane without a parachute. And so when we were talking about systemic change, what really, I'm an advocate of community schools, and I have been thinking how it combines your two great philosophies. I don't know about federal and state and bureaucratic control, because when it gets down to teacher incentivization, we're dealing with labor unions coming in with management, and it comes out to be a little equal, and we don't get much change there. But community schools seems to reflect the community and bring in the grassroots and the parents. What do you guys think of community schools as a parachute?
Well, in my mind, community schools and charter schools have a great deal in common with each other. I tend to think of charter schools as being a version of community schools, often indigenously created by an organization or individual in that community and serving people from a particular community. Many of them, incidentally, Latino, at least in a lot of charter schools that I've been in and seen. And I think that the community schools that you're talking about, I believe, are more of the sort of Flint, Michigan district allowed or district encouraged community schools, and that's fine too. That's a way of often delivering multiple services, engaging local folks in the decision-making process, things like that. That's fine too. I don't know whether there's evidence, I simply don't know, that in terms of academic achievement and gap closing, that community schools, as you're thinking of them, have been shown to be an effective strategy for boosting performance and narrowing gaps. I just don't know. Maybe there is evidence that I'm not acquainted with.
Mark, this moment, I think we agree about that.
Great. Additional questions?
Hi, Gary Ratner, Citizens for Effective Schools. First, I'd just like to comment that I think the context for this is basically, for what Checker's suggesting, is privatization. And we need to keep that very much in mind. If you go to a charter school situation, essentially you've got public money supporting private management, and the individual citizens are going to have really no control over what goes on as citizens in those schools. But in terms of questions, I'm very concerned about, Checker, about some of your premises here. You talk about middle management.
Can you get to the question, sir?
Yeah, I've got two questions.
Okay.
You talk about middle management, and the suggestion, as I understand it, is that in business has eliminated middle management. And if that's true, it strikes me as indefensible. I mean, if you talk about IBM, if you talk about
Sir,
Walmart,
can you get to the question, Mark?
Yeah, my question there is how do you defend your suggestion that middle management is abolished in effective businesses? The second question has to do with governance. You draw what I think is an incorrect conclusion that because these schools have been governed by the districts, therefore that's the reason that they're failing. And it's equally likely, in fact, I think it's more the case that it's because of the content of what the schools do. Some of the charter schools succeed, some of the public schools succeed. It's because of the specifics of what they're doing, not the governance structure. How do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, I don't regard privatization as a dirty word, and I don't think that government-run schools are any freer of self-interest than privately operated schools and vendors. It's just that the self-interest manifests itself in different ways. I certainly would not contend that every American corporation was admirably managed. If that were the case, we might not be engaged in all of our current economic difficulties. I'm just saying that management doctrine, which I believe is correct and which high-performing companies tend to employ these days, empower the production unit and hold them accountable for results and do not have a lot of middle management monitoring their every move. Sorry, your other question was what? How do I justify... Oh, well, effective schools tend to be effective schools in any sector, and the effective schools literature that we've seen having to do with clear mission and coherent curriculum and good leadership and a unified team and high expectations and so forth and so on. That effective schools literature tends to apply to private schools and district schools and charter schools where they're good. Of course, our great tragedy as a country is there aren't nearly enough of those schools in any sector today to meet the needs of the kids, especially disadvantaged kids, and of the larger society. So what we're conjecturing about up here is which form of governance do we think is most likely to produce more of them. I don't think that the district governance structure should be expected to produce more of them. I have higher hopes for the CMO and alternative structures than I do for district structures. It's almost as simple as that.
Gordon, did you want to add to that? You're looking pensive.
No, I am
okay.
pensive all the time.
Okay. We're getting a little away from questions, so if people can limit their questions to 2 sentences, one of which clearly ends in a question mark, I'd appreciate that.
Hi, Catherine Hilden, representing the First 5 Years Fund. And you, Gordon, mentioned in particular starting early as a way to close the gap. My question is how early do you recommend starting? And both of you could comment on that, as we know the research shows the gap shows up long before kindergarten. And do you see any way that the Abbott model, a diverse provider model, could be developed in other states absent a court mandate?
That's a political question, and I don't know enough. Yes, it could be. I mean, theoretically, at least, and maybe. I don't think it's. I think it depends, and it's. But that's really a political question as to its practicality. I think you start as early as you can. My interest in starting with 3-year-old preschool is the fact that you can connect it to the only institution that all poor kids will come in contact with, which is the public school system, and that allows for the opportunity that you can't get anyplace else. And I don't see starting earlier than 3. Frankly, I think it's tough enough to get parents to walk their 3-year-olds to preschool, and I don't think we have much experience, enough experience to say it should start earlier than that. But I'm in favor of dealing with all of the issues facing particularly poor parents as early as you can deal with them, and it would be beneficial to the kids if you did. But I'm interested in the link with public schools.
Well, Sarah is nearly perfect, but she did err in introducing me, because the most recent book I wrote is actually about preschool, as she well knows. And it's called Reroute the Preschool Juggernaut, and it is an argument in favor of highly intensive, highly targeted preschool programs for very needy kids, and an argument against the universal preschool approach attached to public schools for all 4-year-olds or all 3- and 4-year-olds that I think Gordon is advocating.
I've not advocated that.
I thought that was what you were just saying.
No, I'm talking about in poor districts.
Okay.
That's what I'm talking. And
All right.
Abbott is based on dealing with poor kids,
forgive
not
me.
with dealing with everybody.
Then we agree again. Except that I'm mistrustful of school districts as the deliverer of these services. The school districts that cannot succeed with the kids they've got in K through 12, Bill Bennett used to joke about the myth of the 14-egg omelet. You have a chef who does a dreadful job of producing an edible omelet with 12 eggs. Why would you think that adding 2 more eggs to the mix would produce a better result if the recipe's no good? And I sort of feel that way about school districts, just adding a grade or 2 of earlier kids to a district that can't succeed with the kids it's got.
Additional questions?
Hi, I'm Peggy Siegel, Education Free Agent, and I have a quick question for each of you. Gordon, New Jersey has a rich past of states moving in and taking over school districts, and I'm just wondering if you could share some highlights as you think about enriching district ability to deal with them from your perspective. What are some things that could help in this environment? And then, Checker, for you, as you're thinking of scaling schools to state, are there incentives that could be built in that engage charters, magnets, the innovative folks like KIPP and others who have a model where rather than competing, they could collaborate, cooperate, so you'd have a rich environment of schools from the state level, some incentives that could push on cooperation as opposed to proliferation and fragmentation. Thank you.
New Jersey took over the 3 largest districts in the state over a period of 6 years. Jersey City has been in state operation since 1989. It doesn't work by and large. The law allowed the state to replace and select the 5 top executives in each district and to monitor, evaluate, and discharge principals who are eligible for tenure in New Jersey in the first year. After that, the state had little say except for the employment of the superintendent. and that has been the case. The idea that from Trenton you can, Newark is $1 billion budget with 45,000 kids, operating in 84 schools with hundreds of thousands of transactions every year, and the expectation is that you can assure the public that they're not going to spend too much on flowers at the farewell party for Mrs. Smith. And you can't do that. And the idea that you're going to be able to interpose yourself in something that complicated, I think, is unrealistic.
Well, there's any number of ways that states could give incentives to KIPP-like ventures to grow. They'd start with equal funding, with facilities, and with freedom from a bunch of burdensome certification rules. If states did those kinds of things, then CMOs such as KIPP and lots of others would grow a whole lot faster. Because they'd be able to. Right now, they're pushing the boulders uphill every time they try to open another school. Cooperation, I'm not sure, is a virtue, however, in this space. I think we're talking about a field in which competition and some diversity within the framework of standards and tests may have more going for it than a cooperative model. And I'd like to get to the day when cooperation was the solution to a problem, but right now I think vibrant competition might do us more good. Again, within some quality parameters. We've got a lot of competing schools today that aren't worth the paper they're printed on, so they're competing for kids and everything, but they're not worth attending. But that goes to another whole topic in the charter world, having to do with the sponsorship and accountability and so on, which I don't think we have time to do justice to today.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions, I think, and then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to ask a question. Are you familiar with Professor Sharkey's research? But what Professor Sharkey is saying is something we don't want to hear, and therefore we want to negate it. He's saying that these children, no matter what you do, are not going to be mobile in this society. But what he presents is the William Julius Williams' research. He presented the thesis that when jobs disappear, the community, the pedagogy is the community is in a state of disintegration, and that affects the schools. Now, you also said that, and I thought this was very interesting, Marty Blank, they are orchestrating community schools, and they have a plethora of evidence that community schools make a big difference. Arnie Duncan, the president's Secretary of Education, has sounded the alarm.
Sir, have you already asked your question whether they agreed with?
Well, I want to ask one more question.
Okay, can you get to it quickly?
Yes, I will do it as fast as possible. Okay, if you'll permit me to do this. Okay, now Professor Duncan, Arnie Duncan is saying, okay, we need more community schools. Now, do you think, and what Professor Sharkey's paper illustrates, when you work on the community, you help the parents, that enhances educational achievement. Now, there are three places in which he illustrates that this has happened. One is in Milwaukee, the Hope Project, the Harlem Zone Project, and HUD. They also orchestrated a similar project. Okay. And let me ask, that's the second question.
I think you've already asked your question, sir, so let's get the answers from them.
What is the question?
I'm not acquainted with Sharkey, I'm sorry. I do think that I'm just not acquainted with him. I think that the Harlem Children's Zone, which is one of the examples you offered, is an admirable effort at mobilizing a community, reinventing schools, and giving it a powerful community base. I think the research there is still, I think the jury's still out in terms of effectiveness, in terms of student achievement, or at least what the causes of gains in student achievement may be in that complex of services and programs.
We agree.
Great.
That's all right.
Well, Miriam, I think you can ask your question after the conversation is over, since you've already gotten to ask one question. Checker or Gordon, do either of you have any additional points you want to make before we close? Anything you really want to get off your chest?
Gordon's a terrific guy.
I agree.
Well, that's nice. Great way to end the conversation. Thank you all for coming out today, and look forward to seeing you here in the future.